This is Dr. Bryson, and this is a video about the school to prison pipeline for the juvenile justice class. I wanted to point out that there are a couple of theories behind the idea of the school to prison pipeline that you need to know before we actually get into what I call the steps towards prison. First, we need to understand the idea of developmental criminology. We have life course persistent versus adolescence limited offenders. So you need to know that theory, um, which you'll learn more about in the criminology course. We also studied this in an earlier chapter in the book, so you can go back and read all of the theorists about the or I'm sorry, about developmental criminology. Suffice it to say that there are some youth that begin their criminal careers earlier and are more likely to then have a criminal career into adulthood. School to prison pipeline is an alternative, but can also be compatible with um, developmental criminology. It's also important to understand labeling theory and differential association theory when we talk about the school to prison pipeline. Because what happens when we take these steps that we're going to talk about here in just a minute is that we engage in labeling of the youth, but we also engage in a process of mixing youth that have already gotten in trouble. And so they're spending more time with other people who've gotten in trouble, which actually increases the likelihood, according to differential association theory, that they will get into more trouble. The other thing is that this is a sociological theory. When we say it's a sociological theory, we are looking outside of the individual. So there is an external locus of control pushing the youth towards adult criminal behavior. Now, that does not mean that the school to prison pipeline is incompatible with the idea that individuals still have the ability to make their own decisions. So when we talk about the uh, determinism versus free choice or free will, um, the school to prison pipeline does not have to reject the idea of free will. It simply explains why certain individuals, in exercising their free will, are more likely to engage in further crime. So let's look at the steps. Okay, so the first step is what I call the serious incidents step um, in creating this pipeline. So we had all of these serious incidents, kind of going back into the 80s, but really in the 90s. So we had um, East Carter High School in Kentucky, which, by the way, is around a 30-minute drive from Huntington, West Virginia. So East Carter High is close to home. It was one of the very first modern school shootings. We had the school shooting at Columbine High School. You already know about Yummy. We talked about gangs already in the schools, out in California especially, which created the idea of needing school resource officers. So step two in creating this prison um, or school to prison pipeline is the idea that test scores should be tied to funding in a system of rewarding excellence. So we have these standardized tests that we give. In West Virginia, it used to be called the West test. I don't know if that's still what it's called. When I was in school back in the 70s, we called them achievement tests. Um, so there were all sorts of different kinds of standardized tests. Um, Now, what we did is we started saying that the schools that had the higher scores earned more funding. They proved that they deserved more funding. Now, that sounds like it is a meritocracy. And a meritocracy is a good thing, right? We reward people for working hard. However, when we're looking at an entire school, we're not looking at an individual, a single teacher within a school. We're looking at the entire school. So if we are looking at a school in a school system, um, and we're so let's say that this particular school is in a very low income neighborhood. Both parents have to work, or there may only be one parent in the home, and that parent has to work three jobs just to pay the bills and not really putting any money back in savings or preparing for the future because they don't have any to do that with. No disposable income. So that child comes home, mom, dad aren't there to help with homework because they can't be there to help with homework. And then when the children go to school, because this is a poor school, the school board isn't giving them the same amount of money, things like that. So they have fewer resources available to them. Maybe the test scores aren't a lack of hard work or trying to succeed. Maybe those lower test scores are about having fewer resources already. Maybe the problem with one school having lower test scores is a lack of resources. So if we punish them by taking even more resources away to reward the other school, then we're simply creating more and more problems in that lower school. Okay, so here's what happens. This is where we get our zero tolerance policies now. Okay, adding these two things together. So we've got a zero tolerance policy. So if a kid is caught with a knife at school because of things that happen at East Carter or Columbine, they may just be carrying a pocket knife because that's what guys do sometimes. Um, Yet zero tolerance. So we're going to treat them as though they brought that knife to school to stab someone. They may have forgotten that their shotgun um, is in the trunk of their car from where they went hunting. That we are going to treat them as though they were a school shooter. They were going to do this mass casualty event at school, and they had no plan on that. They just forgot the shotgun was in there. So, zero tolerance policies, because we want to make sure we don't have these things going on at schools. We want to make sure we don't have those. So, if we have a zero tolerance policy on the very small end, then we don't have to worry about the bigger end of things, these serious incidents. Now, let's think about the fact that the kids that get in trouble the most are also typically the ones that perform worse on standardized tests. So now we can actually get our test scores for our whole school up by using these zero tolerance policies to simply expel them from the school. We're going to get them out of the school. And that way, their bad performance on tests won't affect our test scores, and it can help our funding for our school. Now, on top of that, we also add school resource officers into the mix because of the zero tolerance policies, because of the serious incidents that we've had throughout history since the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. So, the gang problem. So, we add these school resource officers, and the school resource officers are seeing things that in the past, even though they technically are status offenses, meaning that they would be crimes for someone underage, but they wouldn't be for an adult. But so those school resource officers see these status offenses And so more and more teens, youth are getting charged with delinquency, um, which is interesting because even though they've widened the net, so they're catching more of it when it happens in the schools because the officer is there, we actually can see juvenile delinquency rates declining as they're actually widening the net and actually um, addressing in a criminal way more and more school behaviors. So it's just interesting to me that it seems like we're doing things backwards. But anyway, so the school resource officers are there to help. So now we get this kid labeled. We now, and through the label, we put them in alternative schools and all these other programs. And then they mix in with other kids who've gotten into trouble. And so now they just sit around and influence each other to get into more trouble because they don't have the same positive influences now that they're separated out. Um, um, and the alternative schools don't give them the same level of education. They don't grade them as tightly, but their grades still end up not being all that great, and they're not getting the education that they need. And I mean basic math skills, so they can do a checkbook for heaven's sakes, just those kinds of things. So we're pushing them out of the system into a situation to where crime is the only thing that actually pays for them. Now, remember, if we're going to espouse classical criminology, which is the idea that we need to convince people that crime doesn't pay, um, then this whole system just isn't working. What we've done is we've taken away complete discretion. Now, let me give you an example of a zero tolerance policy that I knew of. There was a school system in New England that had a policy, no guns in school, including toy guns. So no toy guns. So it was Halloween. Um, and this has been about 15 years ago, but maybe even longer than that, but it was Halloween. And so this kid wanted to honor, I believe he was 7 years old. He wanted to honor his hero dad, who was in the army and was actually in Iraq at the time. And so he made this army uniform and he took those little toy soldiers, those little tiny toy soldiers that aren't even as big as my finger, and he glued some on a hat and wore it to school. He was expelled under zero tolerance policies because that toy soldier had a gun in its hand, and they said he brought a gun to school and they expelled him. That's how these zero tolerance policies work. They have no forgiveness. No forgiveness. All right. So criminalizing poor test performers equals an absence from the test scores for those poor test performers. In other words, we're going to criminalize them, and that way we can keep them absent from taking the tests, so their scores aren't going to be in the test scores, and that equals better funding for the school. That's how the school to prison pipeline works. And that's why these kids will end up in prison, many of them. We're actually taking away some of their resources. All right, I'm going to stop the screen share so that you can see my face, just a little bit at least. I hope that this has helped you understand the school to prison pipeline. Now, one of the things I didn't say, and it seems like I completely agree with this whole concept of the school to prison pipeline. One of the things I didn't say is that maybe I don't completely agree with it, but I wanted to present it to you in such a way that you understand the concept. This is what we're trying to say with the school to prison pipeline. We're trying to get folks to understand we've got to stop with these zero tolerance policies. And we've got to stop basing our funding on schools on a meritocracy when the idea of looking at an entire school with all of the teachers without considering the context and the resources they had, and was the deck already stacked against them because of a lack of resources, that those teachers may be working harder, but because they are in a context where school performance is even harder to uh, get for a lot of reasons, it ends up um, rewarding people simply for already having resources. So giving them more resources simply because they already have some. It sounds logical. It sounds like a meritocracy to say the schools with the best test scores get the best funding, will be given the best funding. It's more likely true to say the schools with the best funding have the best test scores. So the way to fix that is to try to make sure that the funding is better for those lower performing schools. Maybe they're lower performing because they need more resources. And if we give them more resources, they might be able to have an impact, keep more kids from dropping out of school. By the way, school dropouts, that is known to be a risk factor for adult crime. Pretty significant risk factor. Just saying. Okay. So let's think about that and consider that as we continue studying juvenile justice.